I feel that people who are sitting on a lot of what I call it is lazy equity, or people who have been smart enough and commercially sound in paying down their debt fast using various different strategies. How do you use that equity that you've saved up, whether it be through your real savings or genuine savings or the growth in the property, and how do you reinvest that money back to grow more wealth in a manner where you're not sacrificing your lifestyle? I think that's the key words here. Hello and welcome to Help Me Buy Property podcast. This is season 2 and the fun times begin. And today's topic is how to go bankrupt guaranteed by doing this. Such a cliche topic. Now, leaving the money in the bank that is eaten away by inflation is basically what we are going to talk about. And we're going to talk about ways to navigate through how to not go bankrupt. Now, before we open this conversation up, drum rolls, let me introduce my co-host, Miss Cheryl. Cheryl, how are you feeling today?
I am amazing as always. It's so cool to be doing season 2. How cool is that? Is it going to be like Friends? We're going to go up to season, I don't know what they ended up being, season 50.
Season 55, Can you imagine season 60. You'd be old and gray.
55. But this is, talk about triggering. Nobody wants to go bankrupt.
Yes.
What are we really talking about, and how do we avoid? I mean, bankruptcy is one of those situations that everything needs to hit the fan
100%
to really get to that point. Tell us what are we really trying to put together here, and the strategies to really think about how to preserve our wealth.
Sure.
I guess that's what we're looking at. Preserve our wealth and grow our wealth.
See, we've been always taught since very young is cash is king, right? And so you look at our ancestors, even my father-in-law, they always save money in the bank because money in the bank is safe, right? What they don't tell you in school is that leaving the money in the bank is basically that money is being drained and eaten away by inflation. What is inflation? For people's sake, inflation is paying $50 for a haircut that used to cost $10 when you had hair. It's basically called inflation. And so you're constantly losing like 2, 3, 4, 5% every year, depending on where the inflation sits. And so your money is technically going backwards. Any money that you have today is not the same amount that is going to be tomorrow. Your money is worth a lot more today versus tomorrow. And so leaving that money in the bank is the easiest way for you to go bankrupt, correct?
I've got a story to tell about that, but no, please go ahead.
And so, understand this from a bank's perspective, and this was an eye-opener for me when I first realized this, that system actually wants you to stay financially uneducated. Because guess what? If you are financially uneducated, you're a sheep who's employed, pays the biggest amount of taxes, and you are the consumer, and we all know rich don't pay taxes, and so they're hated for it. And so instead of your money working for you, it's the people working for the system, right? And so you are not playing the same game, or you're not playing the game with the rules that are set by elites of the society, right? And that's why they're hated for it. I say this in all honesty, hand to heart, is majority of the times when people try to become rich, they try the way around tax invading, which is illegal. Whereas a smart play is tax planning, which isn't, and so the whole conversation today would be, how do you basically go down that path on using your non-tax deductible debt and converting into a tax deductible debt, and not just keep money in the bank for the sake of calling yourself rich and creating real wealth, rather than just nominal wealth that just shows up on the paper.
Yeah. And there's something that you raised that's incredibly important. You talk about tax planning, and this is probably it's for another topic. However, tax planning, it does highlight the need to really have an accountant who really understands your position strategically. And the reason why we want to highlight this is I know someone I've just spoken to not long ago, and he was very, very excited. He sold, he sold quite a few of his property. He's thinking that he had quite a bit of cash to be able to then reinvest and sort of set himself up, again, to be able to go in and buy more properties. However, not sure whether he consulted his tax advisor, but basically his advisor says, you've got a whole lot of CGT, you've got a whole lot of tax you need to pay. I don't think you're going to have as much money in the bank as you think, So two really important things there. One, get a really, really good tax advisor who understands, particularly we're talking about property here, who really understands property and is really able to understand your structuring and planning and the strategy around how do you achieve things financially. When I say financially, from a tax perspective, how do you be the most tax effective? We're not saying tax evasion. It's about being effective in your tax. And there are ways to do that. I'm not an expert in that area. However, I do engage someone who is, and they're able to advise on what we need to do with superannuation, because they can advise on superannuation or my business. And I know that's one thing we're going to talk about, like business owners. Yes, you can make good money, but we need to also tax plan that as well. And hence,
it's a fine.
But
it's a fine balance between you saving the tax versus you paying the tax to grow your wealth. As a business owner, naturally you default to, I don't need to pay tax, and so the more tax I save, the more disposable income I make. Versus, hey, it's okay to pay tax because that you showing yourself profitable gets you an opportunity to grow your wealth faster. And again, we're going to open up this conversation and this topic in one of the upcoming episodes, and it's an amazing topic on how to perfectly leverage a tax system as a business owner. And so do watch out on some of the few episodes that are coming through in the pipeline.
Absolutely. Okay, let's keep going.
So let's go back and so understand the banking system. I think typically understanding the banking system is quite important, right? So if you leave the money in the bank, say, for example, for 1% or 0.5% return or even 2% return, right? From a bank's perspective, it's a liability to the bank because the bank has to pay that money, right? The bank converts that money or that liability into an asset by lending that money out at 5% or 10% interest rate, right? And so if you're getting money from the bank, your idea should always be to beat inflation by at least 2 or 3x, right? Because then you are ahead of the curve. If you're just leaving the money for that 0.5% to 1% or 2% and inflation tracks at 3 or 4%, of course you're going backwards. And so how do you go about doing this in making sure that you are always ahead of the curve? And the answer to the solution, Cheryl?
Oh, we have to do a drum roll. Is it one word or is it two words? The one starts with D.
And one starts with R.
And we're going to do charades.
Debt recycling.
We're almost in sync with that.
And so, when you talk about that recycling is a strategy which aims to turn your current non-tax deductible loans into a tax deductible investment loan. Okay, this involves basically, you paying down your mortgage or you refinancing your mortgage and reborrowing that money to basically invest. And that's why, the word recycling basically comes into place. So is debt recycling a strategy or is it a product? Is it a service? What is essentially debt recycling? Debt recycling typically is a strategy. And I feel that, people who are sitting on a lot of what I call it is lazy equity, or people who have been smart enough and commercially sound in paying down their debt fast using various different strategies, how do you use that equity that you've saved up, whether it be through your real savings or genuine savings or the growth in the property, and how do you reinvest that money back to grow more wealth in a manner where you're not sacrificing your lifestyle? I think that's the key words here.
Yeah, absolutely. And with debt recycling as well, one of the things to understand, and without going into too much of the financial product discussion, one of the things to understand the difference between the equity that's been sort of organically created in your property versus the active payment of your debt down, which pays off the principal.
Yes.
And when you're doing that as well, you can either choose to put that extra or whatever principal amount back into the principal, or you can also put that into like an offset account.
Definitely.
Or whichever.
Yes.
Which I think we'll touch upon as to, again, without going into the products, as to why one may be easier to use than 100%,
the other. Definitely. And ultimately it comes down to this. And so when you talk about debt recycling, it's basically you trying to make better returns out of the money that is available to you. And so, if you refinance or you go down that path of debt recycling, any excess money that you have access to, what are you doing with that money to generate better returns? And so if the bank is offering you that recycled money back at say 5% or 6% or 7% loan, can you generate 14 to 25 to 30% return on that cash that you're getting, right? Because ultimately that's the wealth creation tool and the strategy that you're going to follow.
And here's where people go, what do you mean like 20% to pay off? Because you don't want to be paying the bank back money, right? You don't want to be owing them money. At the moment, interest rates are 6-7% if you're borrowing at the moment, and you're offering fixed rates. So you want to make sure you've got some money paying back to reduce that, to pay off the interest on the equity that you've accessed, but then obviously make some money on top, some cream on top, to hopefully continue to pay off.
Definitely.
As well. That's what we say. So, and we've done lots of different episodes on high yielding strategies. So have a look through our previous episodes on that. But again, it's in simple numbers. Know what it is that you're paying in interest, and then have at least a minimum goal of what is my return on investment on that.
100%. Definitely.
Is that what we're saying?
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I think the important thing to also consider is debt recycling is usually synonymous to the word, refinance, or I'm getting a cash refinance or a home loan equity refinance. Of course, the easiest way is to think about this, especially in Australian terms, where your principal place of residence, any interest that you pay is non-tax deductible. And so how do you use that equity to convert it from a non-tax deductible to a tax deductible loan, to cash fund the future investment decisions, basically. Typically, that's what you're doing, right? And you're trying to generate income from that money that you're going to get out. And that money is now, because you're generating income out of it, naturally becomes a deductible debt.
Yeah. Can we slow that down a little bit more? So we're going to talk about non-deductible debt. Get your the tax advice around it. There's non-deductible debt, which if you're paying off your principal place of residence, it's all non-deductible debt. Rule number one. However, if it's for an investment, it's generally deductible debt.
Right. 100%.
Correct.
Yes.
All right. Yeah. So that's the rule. If there's anything that you want to take away from this episode, is those two things. So, and that is why we're talking about leveraging the equity from a non-deductible property, which is your principal place of residence, to be able to leverage any equity to then take that out to invest in investments.
Definitely.
Which may allow you deductible debt. I'm saying may, again.
Yes. And let's understand this with an example. I think taking people through a case study, I think makes a lot more sense. And so let's assume you're a Melbourne sider, you're buying a principal place of residence, you bought it for $800,000. And 3 years down the track, this house is worth, say, $1 million. Okay. I can't say Sydney because you can't find anything for $800,000 in Sydney. So I have to use Melbourne or Brisbane. But let's say...
studio. You can get a studio for $800,000.
Yes, yeah. Student accommodation. Yes. Yeah. Tiny houses. That's what they're called, Cheryl. Tiny houses these days. That's the new buzzword. You're buying a tiny house.
Yeah.
So
we've got potentially $200,000 worth of equity in simple
Correct.
terms.
And so anyone who has gone through this cycle, they would understand and know that in normal circumstances, the bank would, if your borrowing capacity allows you to do that, the bank would give you 80% of whatever equity that you've built up as redraw or equity refinance made available back to you. And so you would have hard cash of $160,000 available to you, right? A lot of people use this because the banks are not very clearly articulate this. And so they'll say, oh, you have equity and you can use this to cross your loan and we'll give you 100% loan on something else. Technically, what is happening is that this is the amount of money that you can basically withdraw as cash as your own money because it's your house and its value has gone up. And so the bank is revaluing the property again from $800,000 to $1 million. They're taking it back to 80% and they're basically refinancing or giving you the money back. And so let's say now you have access to $160,000 and this $160,000 attract an interest rate of say 6%. Okay. Now the first and foremost is that as soon as you get this money, the first thing that you should do is place it in an offset account and don't keep it anywhere else, right? Because as soon as you take it out of the offset account, guess what happens? You start paying 6% interest, and without realizing the fact that that interest has kicked in. And so while your repayments change as well, as soon as you get access to that equity, because your repayments would go up, if you keep that money in the offset account, majority of that repayment that has gone up still goes towards the principal. Okay. Now understand that this interest of 6%, if you draw this money out from the offset account, is basically a non-tax deductible debt. Okay. So if you go out and buy a car for $160,000, that's a non-tax deductible debt. You go out on an expensive holiday for $60,000, that's a non-tax deductible debt. Right. And so, and so you don't do any of that because that money needs to be converted to a tax deductible debt. And so when you refinance this, typically what you want to do is you want to invest this money to a place that can basically generate income towards you or generate income from that money. And as soon as that happens, as soon as that return basically starts coming in, what you're now doing is you're converting this from a non-tax deductible debt to a tax deductible debt. Okay. Now, going back to the original question that, if the bank is offering you 6% loan at 6% or 7% interest rate, what you want to do with this extra $160,000 is that you want to get a return of more than 6%, predominantly at least 2x or 3x, so 12% or 18% return on this $160,000 to basically create more wealth. Now, let's assume the scenario at around 12%, which basically means that you need to invest this money into a product that is going to give you 12% return. Okay.
Yeah.
Property is one of the easiest and the safest means to do that. You can use this money as a deposit to the next property, and you can generate capital growth plus yield from that particular property. I'm saying that it's not just property. You can use that money to do anything. And again, please don't constitute this as a financial advisor, financial planning advisor, tax advice. I've seen people doing crypto with this money. I've seen people doing equities and trades and NFTs with this money, and you would make a lot of money against it. Anything that you do to generate income from this money basically converts it into a tax deductible debt. The most important point that I want to say, and I'll open the floor, Cheryl, just a very important point. A lot of people think about this, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail as well, that a lot of people think that this money that they are getting, it's better for them to just offset it against the house. And I always say to people that this cash that you're going to get from the bank is a lot more valuable than the new loan that you're going to get from the bank. So always take this as a gospel, as a rule of thumb. Refinance first and buy later. Don't just buy with the equity. Okay, so that's a rule of gospel. Always refinance first and then buy later. Sorry, Cheryl, I cut you off.
Yeah. No. I was just saying in terms of, you were saying the return that you want on that equity that you've taken out. We've used the scenario where you've got about 6% that you're paying on interest. So one of the questions would be, how do you get 12%? How do you get 18%? Where am I getting that? Because if, say, for example, I've got 160,000,
sure.
Like, where am I going to put that to get 18%? Tell me. Why didn't you tell me this 20 years ago, boss? What are you hiding? How do you work that out?
It's very simple. And so let's play that scenario out as well. And so let's say that you use $160,000 of that deposit and you buy a property worth, say, $450,000. Okay. That $450,000, let's suppose that paying 2% deposit or 20% deposit towards that $450,000 property, and 5 or 6% towards stamp duty, etc. And so all up, you're using about $117,000 to $120,000 worth of money out of the $160,000 that you are basically using. Okay.
So can we just break that down? It's sort of about $90,000 you use for the deposit,
and the balance is for stamp duty.
Right, and then the stamp duty, legals, correct, whatever.
Yeah. So you've used $120,000 of this money. Now, if this property goes from $450,000 to say $500,000 or say $550,000, okay, over a period of 2 years, now you've made an extra $100,000 on this property against an investment of, drum rolls, $120,000. Yeah. And so that $100,000 on top that you've made by investing $120,000 is basically well over 80% cash on cash return. Yeah.
Wow.
And so,
But that's if you the equity uplift.
yes,
Okay, sounds sad. Let's assume there's uplift in the equity. But what if I've got to pay off my loan 6% every
yes,
single month on
yes.
$160,000, which is already causing me sleepless nights. But I need money to pay off the loan and pay the equity loan, but I also need some money to pay off my
Of
original
course.
loan.
Yes.
So how do I achieve
And so,
that?
and that's where the catch 22 is. What you need to ensure typically is that any property that you touch generates enough income for you to support that property and keep it not only that loan as cash positive, but also the original loan of $120,000 that you've got at 6% and keep it net positive. Now, in some cases, because the interest rates are so high, say 6.5%, you might get a property, say, generating 7% yield. And so you might be chipping in maybe, say, extra 0.5% a year from your own disposable income in order to hold that property, right? And that's fine, because ultimately what you're doing in this scenario is you're generating 80% return, let's assume over a period of 2 years. And so 40% return per year, even out of that 40% return that you're generating cash on cash, if you're using 5% of your own money, you're still 35% ahead from a net wealth perspective. Yeah. The most important, and it's a very important question that a lot of people get really excited about these returns, and they're like, oh, wow, this is great. This is awesome. So every time I get an equity uplift, I'll use this money and I'll go out and buy another property. And I get an equity uplift, I'll go out and buy another property. And it's a real domino effect, because what you're doing is you're basically cash striving your property portfolio. Your cash flow keeps getting impacted every time you do that. And so it's important to balance this property portfolio with a high cash flow strategy, so that you don't go into this mix of, oh, my property portfolio now all of a sudden, while it's have a lot of equity, it's not generating enough cash flow, and I'm using a lot of my disposable income towards the cash flow. Again, so how do you make your property portfolio sustainable? And that comes back to some of our cash flow episodes that we've talked about before, as to how do you balance your property portfolio through cash flow while doing debt recycling.
Yeah, absolutely. So that you then you're able to create that bit of extra on top of your 6%.
Correct.
So would an example be if you've put in 100,000 into a property and you've got net, then you've net after paying all your interest, or actually we won't say net, let's say gross income, net for property management and all that might be, you might get $10,000 back, for example. So in which case, $10,000 on your $100,000, which is 10%.
Correct.
Gross.
Correct.
Right, and then you've got 6% there. So I'm doing really high level numbers. Just for those of you who are like me, I need to visualize and see what's happening. $100,000, $10,000, gross, but minus property management. Then you've got 6% that you've got to pay the interest, and you've got 4% remaining. So that's how you work out the extra little cream on top that you need to be able. We're not talking about depreciation and your tax deductions and all that. That needs to be worked out individually. However, on a very simplistic manner, that's sort of how you work out.
Well, the worst case scenario is, and so let's play out worst case scenarios, right? Because a lot of people don't think about worst case scenarios. Worst case scenario is that converted a non-tax deductible debt to a tax deductible debt, which basically means that now you are getting 35 cents on a dollar back for any losses that you're making against these, right? Or any interest that you're paying against these. And that's the most important point. A lot of high income earners basically depend on that, because that is money that they didn't have access to before. And they would use that excess 35% on a dollar to basically pay down their own debt faster. And that's one of the easiest way to do that as well, where you're using that tax savings to pay down your principal place of residence a lot more faster as well.
Yeah.
No.
And so how does this affect serviceability
Yes.
then?
And so that's a very good question. And so you would hear people talk about can buy 10 properties in 3 years typically. And, there is a lot of, stigma around some of these where interest rates used to be at 2 to 3%. You would hear a lot of these things that people talk about. Understand that, by the time you're hitting property number 2 or 3, you're not a golden child to the bank anymore. And so how do you set up your structures in such a way, and how do you set up your strategies in such a way that you're bringing in cash flow on top of your normal investments, and you're structuring it up within the trust in such a way that the trust still remains net positive, right? And so that's the $1 million question. And we'll talk about some of these things in our later episodes, where we'll dive down deeper into how do you pay off your principal place of residence faster. And we'll talk into a lot more detail about, okay, what strategies that we can use in the debt recycling theme that can help you not only with creating more passive income, but also paying down your debt a lot more faster as well.
Yeah, and that's the cool thing. I said from the very beginning, a lot of us are sitting on properties that have gone, the equity has gone up so high, quite high over the last few years. They're sitting on little gold mines. He said, but 100%. We're too afraid of what to do, or unsure what we can do. Yet we could potentially have access to all this equity, which allows us to create the allows us to create the long-term lifestyle that we want to create, like through create financial independence, but also pay down our PPOR loans at the same time. So you've got two bites of the cherry in that aspect.
I think one important point to also consider when you talk about servicing also is, and this is me thinking out loud right now, is that, a lot of brokers, when they are communicating or talking to their clients, they put the refinance amount and the brand new loans that they are going to get for a new property in the same bucket. And they say, well, it's either or. And they'll say, either you have access to $300,000 in cash, or you have access to $300,000 of lending. It's the same thing. And I want to break that stereotype today. Technically, that's not always the same thing. That your cash, as the comment that I made previously, is a lot more important than the brand new loan that the bank is going to give you, right? And so if you get that refinance at $300,000, you can always find a second or a third tier lender who would provide you with a borrowing capacity slightly bigger than what your original borrowing capacity was, based on the fact that, you have income coming against that asset that you're going to buy. And also because their way of assessing risks is different from the bank that you're getting refinance from. I'll use an example to help you understand and explain this. And I always use this with my clients, that when we're thinking about new clients versus retention, that's how the banks are typically looking at some of these things as well, okay? And so when you are going out looking for an insurance company, for example, and you're a first-time insurer for a car, you would see every insurer under the sun offers you 10% discount or 15% discount or online discounts, and you see all of these discounts coming to you, right? And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to basically acquire a brand new client, and their risk appetite is very low. And so they're happy to write a slightly higher risky client. But when you go in year 2 and you're with the same insurer, usually you get a bill and the insurance premium has gone up, and instead of you paying $1,000, now you're paying $1,200. And so they don't incentivize you, they actually penalize you for you to being their client, because they have onboarded you at a higher risk, and so they're managing their risk. Banks work exactly the same way. And so when you go to the bank for the first time, they'll do everything in their power to give you the loan because you're a first-time client. Now, if that property grows up in value, they'll make your life a real misery, because you're trying to get that refinance, And so when you get that refinance and take that cash to a brand new lender, they'll treat you as a brand new client, and you all of a sudden basically get access to a lot of servicing. I'll use this example with one of the clients. He's sitting on close to about $1 million on equity. And he said, my broker said to me, I only have access to $400,000 based on my servicing. And I said, okay, so from his perspective, the broker was either you can go out and buy a property for $400 at 100%, 105% coverage, and that's where basically the conversation ends. And I said to him, okay, let's do this. Get your broker to get him to do a refinance for that $400,000. And so we did that. He went to the broker. The broker basically got him a refinance for $140,000 that sits in the offset account. And then we went to a second-tier lender, and guess what? The second-tier lender said you can get a borrowing of almost $800,000. And he was almost gobsmacked. He's like, well, how does this work? So the original bank says I only have $400,000, whereas this bank now is giving me $800,000 in borrowing plus my $400,000, which basically takes me to almost like $1.2 million. And now I can acquire 2 properties instead of not even a single property before. And that's the magic of refinance versus new lending.
Yeah. So let's start to summarize, what are the real benefits of debt recycling, and then what are the risks to consider as well?
Yeah. And I always say, let's start off with the risks rather than the benefits.
Let's do that. Let's get the yucky bits out
let's
first.
start with the risks.
That was the bad news.
Because no one talks about the risks. I think everyone talks about refinance from, of course, growing a portfolio perspective. But the biggest risk that I see with a lot of people is that they end up over-investing because they think that this formula works. And hey, this formula definitely works. But because of them overextending, over-investing, they always fall into cash management problems. And there is massive cash implications around all of these things. What I've also found out is that because it might work for one or two properties, they become a lot more aggressive, which basically means that their opportunity to do a proper due diligence basically drops. And they start making a lot more mistakes in making acquisitions because they think that, this is replicable. I can buy 2 properties or 3 properties in 1 year. Not saying that you shouldn't or you can't. You can. The level of due diligence shouldn't just basically disappear because, this formula or this strategy works. And so those are the two key problems that I always see from my perspective when you're talking about debt recycling side of things.
Yeah. So over-investing, basically going, I've taken all this money out. We also didn't address the fact that it's not about over-investing as well, but using the equity and not investing in it smartly, basically.
Definitely.
Remember the old ads, and the guy comes back and he's bought a boat or he's bought his new Land Rover, and his neighbor says, "Where'd you get that equity, mate?" Don't do that. Sorry, you just there's not at the very beginning we talked about what's deductible and not deductible. So there's the over investing, basically also not being able to pay down the debt, cover the debt, and then not managing that cash flow that you said, or putting that money towards not best investments. And like I said, losing that money, and then basically you're just paying more debt.
And it's important to understand that whenever you have access to refinance, treat it as debt. Don't treat it as your personal bank account. That's what I see a lot of people start doing, They start going on expensive holidays that they couldn't afford anyway. They'll go upgrade their car. They'll pay expensive educational expenses. I understand the notion behind this and why would you want to do it, but sort out your cash flows first. I'm not saying don't do it. Yes, there is a way to use equity to build up your property portfolio and your lifestyle as well at the same time, but you need to have a big enough asset base for you to do that, right? And a low enough LVR for you to do that. If you are leveraged to 80% already, and then you are now using the debt for your lifestyle expenses, then that's not a really good way of spending this money because it still remains non-tax deductible, and you have basically now used this money towards something that generates no income for you, right? It's a depreciating asset typically. We talk about car, boats, caravans, anything.
Yeah. It's fun though. I'm not saying don't get them, but make sure you've got your cash flow. And some of the benefits, again, summarizing the things that we spoke about before, there's a lot of tax benefits, making sure you've got a good tax accountant that can help you with that and plan around that, paying off your PPOR a lot quicker as well. Again, if you're diligent with doing that, putting those funds into offset account as opposed to being in the principal, creating your wealth a lot quicker. And also, I guess with that additional income, that's also increasing your serviceability as well.
Definitely. Yeah. And of course, the benefits always outweighs the risks if the benefits are implemented the proper way, right? Where a lot of people do is they look at the benefits and they always overdo without having a strategy in place. And that's where they start failing miserably. So, there's a lot of upside to this. Make sure that if you're sitting on a lot of equity, come out and speak to the right person, be it your tax plan or get a property plan done to get a bit of an understanding about how to do this in a proper setting. It comes with, please don't try this at home sort of caveats, right? When you're trying to basically do this on your own.
Yeah, if you know really clearly with strategy in place, and we always talk about strategies or a plan and clear management of that. That's like with everything else. It's like you treat your money as a business. write down, plan what you want to create. And if you're unclear of how to do that, then get someone to guide you on it.
Golden words, Cheryl. Thank you very much. And viewers, listeners, if you have any questions, comments, feedback, please feel free to jump in. Share your own stories as to how have you used the lazy debt or the lazy equity that was sitting in your property portfolio to generate more wealth. It's always good to grow in together as a community. Stay safe, keep smiling, be kind, keep investing. This is Moss and Cheryl checking out. Adios.
Ciao, ciao.